Hi, I'm Professor Green, and now let's talk a little bit about the nature of the foreign exchange market. This is Chapter 10, Part 2 of 3. The first thing is that the foreign exchange market is a global network of banks, brokers, and foreign exchange dealers connected by electronic communication system. The market is always open somewhere in the world, which I think is a really fun fact, especially coming from the world of international business, right? It is unique in that there, because there's so many different time zones, but there's always one foreign exchange market that is trading. London is the biggest one, right? New York, Zurich have also large ones, and there's a 3-hour window supposedly when none of those larger markets are open, but then smaller markets are open. San Francisco and Sydney, they mentioned. And so that's really exciting to see that, business is always moving. If exchange rates were quoted in different markets, and not at the same, if they're quoted in different markets and they're not the same, there'd be an opportunity for what's called arbitrage, this process of buying a currency low and selling it high. But because this happens, because people are constantly people involved in the Forex markets are constantly watching their computer screens. If these fast gains are available, they happen very quickly and they disappear in minutes. But it's good to be familiar with what this idea is. Most transactions involve US dollars on one side, mostly because it's such a large currency, and just like English is the most common language, it's hard sometimes to find like someone who's trying to sell Mexican pesos and buy Japanese yen, for example, at the same time. And so then they'll just do is, sell or buy US dollars from the Mexican pesos and then buy or sell the Japanese yen from there. So that's why they call it the US dollar is a vehicle currency. So let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. We're going to talk about here three different factors impacting the future foreign exchange movements. So again, if you're an international business, right, you really want to be able to predict as accurately as possible if the exchange rate is going to change, because then you'll know whether you should buy product now or sell product later, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to spend a couple of slides talking about price inflation, a couple of slides talking about interest rate, and then talking about market psychology, which is a really fun situation that happened with George Soros in 1992. So let's talk about price and exchange rates first. The law of one price here. So this is this idea, otherwise we'll talk a little bit about the Big Mac index in just a minute. The law of one price is that in competitive markets, free of transportation costs, so we're not going to worry about these right now when we talk about these theories or barriers to trade, identical products, right, sold in different countries must sell for the same price when price is in that same currency, right? So that's how markets work when they become efficient. That connects here now to purchasing power parity, which is also known as that Big Mac index. So given relatively efficient markets, right? So if everything's working smoothly, few impediments to trade and investment exist, the price of a basket of goods should be roughly equivalent in each country. PPP predicts that changes in relative prices result in changes in the exchange rate. So if that price of goods moves up or down, then it says that the exchange rate is potentially going to move, and that when inflation is relatively high, a currency should, in theory, depreciate. But that's what we're going to see in the next couple of slides, that these ideas don't always follow through, just as we've seen in previous chapters, that there are a lot of economic theories out there, but they don't always hold true in every situation, right? Because here in the United States, in the last couple of months, right, we have a lot of high inflation. But if you've traveled abroad, you'll notice that actually the dollar is quite strong, right? So there are always like these exceptions to what's happening. And so if you talk to an investment manager or an economist right now, they kind of feel like the US is kind of like guessing. And that's usually how it is. The the economists are kind of always guessing as to how to fix or move the economy. But before I get on to that, let's just make sure that we're familiar with what PPP is. So as I said, it's also sometimes known as the Big Mac Index, which is, I think, is a really useful term to remember. It was a term coined by the economists in the 80s because they were saying that this basket of goods can also be known as a Big Mac because the Big Mac is sold in 120 countries and it's the same, almost the same product from country to country. And so we can now compare this same basket of goods, the same Big Mac, and how much it costs, how much it sells for in each individual country, and compare that. And so I link a video on Brightspace explaining how this works, but the idea is that we divide the price of the Big Mac in the other country divided by the cost of the Big Mac in the United States, and it comes up with a ratio, and then it'll tell you if the currency in that country is undervalued or overvalued. And we can see very quickly, right, places like Switzerland, they're saying that it's overvalued because the Big Mac in Switzerland is so expensive, and et cetera. But like in Taiwan, for example, they say the currency potentially is undervalued because the ratio is very, very low, and the cost of a Big Mac is very, very low. So really interesting to see how this whole thing comes together. And I think that purchasing power parity can be a little bit complex as an idea, but when we think about it in the terms of a Big Mac, potentially a little bit simpler. We have two more slides here talking about prices and exchange rates. So let's keep going with that. Money supply and price inflation. Again, if we can predict inflation rates, we can predict how a currency's value might change. As I said, not the rule right now in the United States here in fall 2022. But theoretically, and in the past, that's been the case. The growth of a country's money supply determines its likely inflation rate. So again, if the country starts printing money, then we're going to have a lot of money in the system, and then the price of things will increase. Because more people have cash and they go out and they borrow cars, et cetera, and then there are not enough cars. There's too much demand, which drives the prices up. When the growth in the money supply is greater than the growth output, inflation occurs. And I love how they use examples here of like developing countries, that traditionally had these issues like Bolivia. But now it's actually the United States, right? That we printed so much money in spring 2022, fall 2021, that we almost instantly got hit with a lot of inflation after the pandemic. So just to finish up their example of a developing country, the value of the Bolivian currency in the 1980s, the Bolivian, depreciated rapidly due to hyperinflation, right? And they say that one of the reasons that Bolivia went wrong was that they decided to exactly print money instead of use what they call political will, which is most likely raising taxes, but politicians don't like to do that to create that money, because then they don't get voted into office in the next election. And so the simple, or I shouldn't say simple, but the easy way out is very often to just print money, as opposed to save money, increase taxes, et cetera. So really important when we think about international business, of course, right? And being able to predict exchange rates in the future, and looking at if a country is printing money and potentially what their current inflation rate and what it could be in the future. Let's do one more slide on price and exchange rates. So here's some empirical tests of the PPP theory. Indicates it's not completely accurate in estimating exchange rate changes in the short run, but relatively accurate in the long run. And a lot about this chapter talks about short run versus long run, and Dr. Anatoly, who taught this course in the past, said, we don't know what's going to happen in the long term, right? There's so many variables that happen, but again, this is how the economists think about it. Are you thinking about investing in the short term, or are you thinking about investing in the long term? The purchasing power parity puzzle, it is a puzzle, right? Assumes away transportation costs and barriers to trade. Governments routinely intervene and in the foreign exchange market so they can buy and sell their own currency or other currencies. And then investor psychology plays a role on exchange rate movements. And so we'll also see this case at the end of our part 2 here. We're talking about George Soros, and he bought a lot of British pounds, and and then he exchanged them for Deutschmark, etc. But what he did, the most important part was that all these other people saw him starting out selling British pounds, and then they jumped on the bandwagon, and that can happen very, very often. So we also want to say that, because George Soros was the head of an organization, he was a part of a hedge fund that was doing this. Also, many multinational enterprises can also have sufficient market power, unfortunately, to influence prices, control distribution channels, and differentiate their product offerings between different nations. So again, there are lots of different variables that go into determining how these theories are going to play out. Now let's talk about interest rates and exchange rates. So deep diving now into this piece. First is the Fisher effect. It's a country's nominal interest rate. A country's nominal interest rate is the sum of the required real rate of interest and the expected rate of inflation. So again, we see, talking about inflation again, over the period for which the funds are to be lent. And so again, when you in a business, you're deciding how long will you need this money, how long will you need, and how much time will you need to buy or sell a particular type of currency. So if the real interest rate is the same everywhere, any difference in interest rates between countries reflect differing expectations about inflation rates, right? So again, why is the US now so concerned about their inflation rate? Yeah, not only because everyone in the US is complaining that things are getting more and more expensive, but also because it helps predict what the economy is going to be like in the future. And this Fisher effect was based from an economist called Irvin Fisher. And he's saying that if inflation is expected to be high, then interest rates will always also be high. And that's obviously what we're exactly seeing here now in the fall. So then there's also the international Fisher effect. This is saying that for any two countries, the spot exchange rate, so the spot exchange today's rate, the current rate, should change in an equal amount, but in the opposite directions to the difference in nominal interest rates for the two countries. So the exchange rate, again, is dependent on the interest rate. And so here here's this equation that we're talking about: the US dollar and the Japanese yen. S1, right, is the spot exchange rate at the beginning of the period. S2 is the spot exchange rate at the end of the period. So the change in rate over the exchange rate at the end of the period. And what I wanted to say about this was, the question now is, do interest rate differentials truly do they predict future currency movements, right? Because that's the decision for you as a manager, right? Will the currency that you're investing in go up or down? And do the interest rates make a change in that? Well, as we often say in economics, perhaps. It depends. It depends, right? That's what my economics professor said at Thunderbird, right? It depends. That if we're talking about the PPP, in the long run, yes, it's pretty effective to help determine future exchange rates. In the short run, deviations can really occur. If we're talking now about the international Fisher effect, which is just slightly different, it's also unfortunately not a good predictor of short-run changes in the spot exchange rates. So let's go ahead and hop into the next slide, the bandwagon effect, right? One of my favorite things here, because as I said, this really happened in 1992, and it really bleeds into a little bit of organizational behavior and how people react in real life. It occurs when expectations on the part of traders turn into self-fulfilling prophecies, and traders join the bandwagon to move exchange rates based on group expectations. Government intervention can prevent the bandwagon from starting, but is not always effective, right? There's only minimal work potentially that the government can do, and sometimes it has to happen so quickly, and the government can't work that fast. So investor psychology is influenced by political factors and microeconomic events. So we just have 2 slides here or one slide on investor psychology, and then we'll finish up a summary of all these slides. So I just want to say that these really play an important part. So we can talk about theories with Fisher, PPP, Big Mac, etc. But at the end of the day, actually, psychology and bandwagon have a huge influence on the foreign exchange markets. Again, I created a link on Brightspace for the case with George Soros in 1992, where he borrowed billions of British pounds in order to buy German Deutschmark. And it's just embarrassing almost to see the British Prime Minister getting on video saying, we're going to change the interest rate twice in a day, and then saying, no, we're not, right? As I said, the government can't work as quickly. And, George Soros just saw a loophole in the situation. They don't happen very often, but he saw an opportunity to make a lot of money. Yeah. And then, because he borrowed those, billions of UK pounds, and then bought Deutschmark, and then, bought the UK pounds back again at a lower price. He made a couple of billions of dollars. Fortunately, we try and stop these things. Governments have worked to avoid those loopholes now in the future, but it still can happen. And as I said, traders and different people can jump on board. So let's talk about the summary of these exchange rate theories. Relative monetary growth, relative inflation rates, and nominal interest rate differentials are all moderately good predictors of long range, right? We see changes in exchange rates, but these factors are poor predictors of short run changes. So again, if you're trying to buy something, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 30 years' time, you'll probably have a safer bet using these theories. But if you're trying to buy something like Apple within the next couple of months, you might not necessarily win using these theories. So international business should pay attention to countries' differing monetary growth, inflation, and interest rates. Great. This was the end of part 2. I'll go ahead and end the video here, and I'll see you again in part 3.